الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Inshallah ta'ala we'll start this series of the fiqh of the hearts, or fiqh al-qulub. And the reason why this title is chosen is because we know the word fiqh means understanding, and it refers a lot to the rulings or the ahkam of the fiqh of the jawarih, or the fiqh of the physical actions, mainly as they call it the jurisprudence, or the things that is related to acts of worship and transactions, and the rulings of how to perform the salah and the tahara and the purification and the fasting and hajj and so on, and the transactions, the contracts and things like this. This is the first thing that a person would think of when the word fiqh is mentioned. But when we think of the fiqh of the hearts, meaning the ahkam, the understanding, the deeds done by the hearts, that is the foundation for the fiqh of al-jawarih, the foundation for the rulings of the physical body, and the most important thing, because without the sound heart, there's nothing valid from the physical actions. As we know that for a deed to be accepted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it has to have the sincerity, which is a deed purely done by the heart, and to follow the way of the Prophet ﷺ. And it talks about the intent, the niyyah, the intentions, and so on. So this is such an important topic, of course, and we should always seek this knowledge, because it's ilm, it's knowledge that needs to be sought, and it's not something that is left for one's imagination or one's desire. And we have to refer to what the ulama, the people of knowledge of this ummah, talked about in the subject of al-qulub, or the hearts. And Ibn al-Qayyim, Sheikh Taymiyyah wrote beautiful books and chapters in the books talking about these different actions and these different deeds done by the heart. And as always, that is mentioned in the beginning of any subject, even in matters of physical actions, we have to make sure that al-ikhlas, or the purity of one's intentions, is the foundation of all things. So very briefly, inshallah ta'ala, in a few minutes, as we know al-ikhlas, and this is a subject, again, as we said, before any subject that we talk about, we need to be reminded of al-ikhlas, which is the core of al-ibadah. Sincerity of intentions, purity of intentions. This is the core of this deen, the core of ibadah. This is the meaning of La ilaha illallah. There's no one worthy of worship except Allah. The purity of one's ibadah to only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أَلَا لِلَّهِ الدِّينُ الْخَالِصِ. Indeed, to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the pure religion. To Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the difference between the deen of al-Islam and the shirk, which is associating partners with Allah, is in the subject of al-ikhlas. Ikhlasul ibadah lillah. The purity of the ibadah to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, versus those who worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and worship other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And also, when a person believes that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the only one worthy of worship, the heart might turn to other than Allah. The heart might seek the pleasure of other than Allah by the ibadah, by the acts of worship. Like for someone to show off his acts of worship, to seek the pleasure of people by the acts of worship that he does. And this is by itself is shirk in one's intentions, is associating partners with Allah in one's intentions by seeking the pleasure of other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in matters of ibadah, in matters of worship, which is supposed to be purely to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that's why it's the foundation of acceptance of deeds. Al-ikhlas is either the way to be among those who are successful in this life and in the hereafter, or to be in loss when a person would do physical actions, but because of the lack of al-ikhlas, or the contamination of the hearts with anything other than the pure intentions and the seeking purely the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it makes a person's actions are waste, or even as foundation for the punishment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so as we heard from the very beginning, La ilaha illallah is called kalimatul ikhlas, the word of purity, because of the purity of intentions that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the only one worthy of worship. Al-Fudayl ibn Iyad, we heard the statement before, when he mentioned the verse that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, الذي خلق الموت والحياة ليبلوكم أيكم أحسن عملا. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that created the heavens and the earth to test you who among you are the best in actions. And also as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فمن كان يرجو لقاء ربه فليعمل عملا صالحا ولا يشرك بعبادة ربه أحدا. Whoever seeks that he would meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, meaning in the day of judgment, so let him do righteous good deeds and not to associate in his ibadah with his Lord anyone. So he said that the deed, it has to be أخلصه وأصوبه. The عمل الصالح ولا يشرك بعبادة ربي أحدا. The deed has to be righteous, which is the most sound deed, and أخلصه, that means it's the most pure of actions, ولا يشرك بعبادة ربي أحدا. And he said, and this is the best of deeds, أحسن عملا أي أخلصه وأصوبه. It means it's the most pure, the most correct deed. And he said, if the actions, if it's sawaban, if it's sound, if it's done according to the way the Prophet ﷺ, but وَلَمْ يَكُنْ خَالِصًا, but it wasn't pure, purely for the sake of Allah, لم يقبل, won't be accepted. وإن لم يكن خالصا وكان صوابا. So if it was then خالصا, if it was pure, but it wasn't صوابا, it wasn't correct, also it's not going to be accepted. If it's not according to the way the Prophet ﷺ, and the person's intention was purely for the sake of Allah, still it's not going to be accepted. Till حتى يكون خالصا صوابا, till it's purely for the sake of Allah and it's according to the way of the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام. And الخالص أن يكون لله, the pure for it to be to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone, والصواب, and what is correct is to be according to the sunnah of the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام. So that's the importance of the subject of al-ikhlas and the intentions, and that the believers, they do things ابتغاء مرضات الله, ابتغاء وجه الله. They seek the pleasure of Allah. They seek to see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the day of judgment. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for example, when he speaks about the believers, he says, وَمَن يَفْعَلْ ذَلِكَ, after mentioning some of the good deeds, those who enjoin or commend others to give sadaqah, charity, or to do righteousness, or to bring peace and rectify the disputes between people. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لا خير في كثير من نجواهم إلا من أمر بصدقة أو معروف أو إصلاح بين الناس. That there is no goodness in many of their secret talks, except those who commends sadaqah, charity, or enjoins good, and إصلاح بين الناس, that he would bring peace among people. Then he said subhanahu wa ta'ala, وَمَنْ يَفْعَلْ ذَلِكَ بِابْتِغَاءِ مَرْضَاتِ اللَّهِ فَسَوْفَ نُؤْتِيهِ أَجْرًا عَظِيمًا. Whoever does this, seeking the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone, we will indeed give him a great reward. So the condition is ابتغاء مرضات الله, seeking the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. And the famous hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, إنما الأعمال بالنيات. And we all know this hadith, that deeds are by their intentions. And every action is according to what the person intended for. So the concern of the heart to be focused on seeking the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. In everything that we spend, the person spend it for the sake of Allah. And we know the hadith in Bukhari where the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام, he said, إنك لن تنفق نفقة تبتغي بها وجه الله إلا أجرت عليها حتى ما تجعل في امرأتك. That you would not spend nafaqa, which means any nafaqa, any spending that you seek in by this spending the wajh Allah, the face of Allah, to see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone, unless you will be given the reward for it, even with the morsel of food that you would put in the mouth of your wife. The ilm that we learn has to be only for the sake of Allah. This ilm that we're learning, that we might teach and things like this, has to be only for the sake of Allah, seeking the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. And makes a person successful, and makes the deeds, even if it's less, becomes magnified by one's ikhlas. And that's the fiqh, the understanding of the niyyah, the understanding and the rulings of a niyyah are so many. And that's why even in matters of fiqh, that is part of the understanding of the niyyah or the intentions, is that it separates al-ibadat, or the acts of ibadah, from the norms, or the normal actions of the people. Like two people or a person taking a shower, it's the same shower that he takes every day. But with the intention, it makes a difference between the shower that if it's done as ghusl, to allow the person to make the salah, versus just a shower that a person is doing to be clean, to clean himself. With the intentions, this is what makes a difference. Some actions is very difficult to have a different intention other than the ibadah, like making wudu, for example. It's not likely that a person would make wudu to cool himself, but he would do this as an act of ibadah to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But a person might do the wudu to please others, and just because everybody's making wudu, so he's making wudu. And this is where it takes the rewards away from the person when he's doing things for other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the Prophet ﷺ, when he talked about al-ikhlas with regards to la ilaha illallah, he said, ما قال عبد لا إله إلا الله قط مخلصا إلا فتحت له أبواب السماء حتى تفضي إلى العرش ما اجتنب أو ما اجتنب الكبائر. That there's no slave of Allah that says La ilaha illallah mukhlisan, sincerely, purely, for the sake of Allah, unless the gates of heavens would open for him till it reaches the throne of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as long as he turns away from al-kabair. So what matters is when a person says La ilaha illallah, to say it with sincerity. And this is with all of the actions that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered us to establish in our life. The ikhlas, or the sincerity, that made the early generations of Islam to be concerned more about their actions and less about what people would perceive from their actions, because they were not seeking anything from the people whatsoever. As Al-Hasan al-Basri rahimahullah, he said, إن كان الرجل جمع القرآن ولما يشعر به الناس, that a man would have the entire Quran in his heart, memorized, but nobody know anything about him. And when كان الرجل لا ينفق النفقة الكثيرة, that a man would spend so much of his wealth and nobody knows anything about him. وإن كان الرجل لا يصلي الصلاة الطويلة في بيته ولم يشعر الناس به, and the man would pray the night prayer, for example, optional salah in his house, and it's a long one and nobody knows anything about it. And as he said, talking about the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, وَلَقَدْ أَدْرَكْتُ أَقْوَامًا مَا كَانَ عَلَى الْأَرْضِ مِنْ عَمَلٍ يَقْدِرُونَ أَنْ يَعْمَلُونَهُ فِي السِّرِّ فَيَكُونُ عَلَانِيَةً أَبَدًا. I've witnessed some people where there was nothing on the face of earth of any action they're able to do in secret, they would ever do it openly. That means if there are means for them to do it without people noticing it, they would do so. But some actions you have to. You enter the masjid and it's virtue to go to the masjid early for the salah. Then you pray the sunnah, you pray tahiyatul masjid, and people see you when you're making salah. What needs to be worked on the heart is to make it sincerely for the sake of Allah, but not to leave the action of goodness because of out of the fear that this might be with riya or showing off. No, this is also a mean of showing off. that a person would leave something also for the sake of people, but to follow the way of the Prophet ﷺ and to work on one's intentions. But something that a person is not from, when this is where the ilm comes in place, when a person with knowledge to see what needs to be done openly, what needs to be done secretly, by following the way of the Prophet ﷺ. So this is part of the fiqh. So as we said, for example, when you go early for the salah, the only one that it's not something that is virtue for him to be in the masjid when it's early, if, for example, the imam, as the Prophet ﷺ used to wait till Bilal radiallahu anhu would come to him and he would make the iqamah for the salah. Because people usually wait for the imam. But for the ma'moom, it's best to pray the sunnah at home, but not the sunnah al-qabliyah or the sunnah that is before the salah. It's best to do it in the masjid, like Sunnatul Fajr, for example. When some people ask, is it more virtue to pray Sunnatul Fajr at home and then come to the masjid? The answer is it's more virtue to go early to the masjid. And when you go early to the masjid, then even if you prayed Sunnah at home, you cannot sit unless you pray 2 rak'ah. And the Prophet ﷺ used to only pray 2 rak'ah between the adhan and the iqamah of Salatul Fajr. So it's then best to go to the masjid and to pray Sunnat al-Fajr and to wait for the salah, because waiting for the salah is a good deed. In addition to the fact that a person would pray the obligatory salah, waiting for the salah is a good deed. So it's best for the sunnah that is before the salah to be done in the masjid. After the salah, if a person is not going to overlook it or forget, or he knows himself that once he go home he forgets the salah, then of course it's best to be done at home. But each person knows his best his own self, and the shaitan has his ways, and his steps for people to stay away from doing the good deeds out of the intentions that they would do it at home, and so on. And the more the person is sincere, there's a statement by Umar radiallahu anhu which is very interesting, that the shaitan whispers to the person to associate partners with Allah in ibadah, seeking pleasure of people, seeking maybe the praise of people or the wealth of people. So with ikhlas, the person is receiving great rewards from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and even with matters of being sufficed when it comes to people. Umar radiallahu anhu, he said, فَمَنْ خَلُصَتْ نِيَّتُهُ فِي الْحَقِّ وَلَوْ عَلَى نَفْسِهِ كَفَاهُ اللَّهُ مَا بَيْنَهُ وَبَيْنَ النَّاسِ. If someone's intention is pure, sincerely, in the truth, even if it's against his own self, even as a result of that pure intentions, the person will lose something or will be against his own self. To say the truth, for example, that might be against him, or something will be, he will be given less as a result of that, or whatever reason. But because of the sincerity, he says, كَفَاهُ اللَّهُ مَا بَيْنَهُ وَبَيْنَ النَّاسِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala kafah. Allah will suffice for him. What's between him and what's between the people. What's between him and the people, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will suffice it for a person as long as he's sincere, that he is sincerely doing things for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So, and that's how the person would make sure that nobody would ruin his action, to make it sincerely for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is when it comes to the subject of, as we heard in the statement, of doing things secretly, when they're, don't have to do it openly, to protect their hearts, to save their hearts. And that's why understanding our hearts, that our hearts can lead us astray or can keep us steadfast on the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. To learn the niyyah, this is more of an effect to one's actions. As Yahya ibn Kathir, he said, and he's one of the narrators of Imam Muslim, he said, تعلموا النية فإنها أبلغ في العمل. Learn النية, learn the intentions, because it's more in perfecting one's actions. And that's even in eating and drinking and in benefiting things and permissible things. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us al-ikhlas. And inshallah ta'ala, in this series, we'll talk about not just the deeds done by the heart, but the understanding that we need to be upon when it comes to our hearts and what's really the essence of our hearts and how to seek the help from Allah, because the hearts are in control of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That Allah ما من القلوب قلب إلا هو بين إصبعين من أصابع الرحمن يقلبه كيف يشاء. There's no heart unless it's between the two fingers of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He changed it the way He will, subhanahu wa ta'ala. So how to keep our hearts steadfast on the deen of Allah if we don't understand the nature of our hearts and how to perfect it and how to rectify it. So this will be in this subject, inshallah ta'ala, and we'll go through some of the statements of the early generations of Islam in this subject, inshallah. So we'll stop here, inshallah ta'ala, because of the time. وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على محمد وصحبه وسلم. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله.